right, welcome to Shoot the Dancing Bear, episode 3 of our podcast. I'm Jesse Roa, one of the 3 hosts of this podcast, along with Gabe Garcia and Tim Malone. Thank you to all of our audience of about 5 people, including my wife and mother, for tuning in to the first couple episodes. Just to give everybody a little bit of an idea of what we're going to go into this week, we're going to lead with the 3 topics and then go into it and do them sequentially. So we're going to begin this week with a discussion of substance use in film, media, whatever. We're going to discuss conspiracy theory afterwards and end with the recent news of the Brexit, which is not necessarily pop culture, but it's political and it's interesting, so we decided we'd go into it. So, like I said, we'll begin with the substance usage stuff. We'll go into that first, and just by way of sort of massaging our way into it and giving us a way in, we're going to begin by sort of thinking about how is it that drug usage or mind-expansive substances really are utilized in the popular culture. How are they represented? What do we see in these things? How does that then inform our politics, right? So we're going to examine all of these things as we go through it, and we'll begin with people who have a little more expertise on the subject than I do, because I'm basically straight edge as there can be. So we're going to go with some people who actually know what they're talking about first, and then maybe I'll contribute something a little bit later. So we'll begin with Gabe and then just go from there.
Awesome. So as I was starting to think about this subject, I was like, I've been paying sort of close attention to what's been happening in the shows. That I think the way in is to talk about the shows that we already have talked about on the podcast, those being Mad Men, Game of Thrones, and Mr. Robot especially. And I just think it's a really interesting question to think about what we're watching as viewers in terms of what substances are being used, how that's treated, how that connects to our own sort of ethics around drug use in our culture. And I'll just start right off with Game of Thrones, and this idea that it's really sort of a reflection of our own values in terms of what drugs are approved of, right? So we see like a real, like, I consider red meat a drug. We have like a real sort of like a predisposition towards like alcohol consumption in the show, and we also see sort of like a demonization of more what you might call subculture usage of drugs, like within season 2 there were the Lotus Eaters, and they were sort of demonized, and they were depicted as these sort of lecherous, kind of decrepit, sort of disgusting characters. But the interesting thing about them is that they could like bend reality. They could appear and disappear. They could steal things, right? But you hear like within the commentary them sort of being demonized. These are these guys that hang around and their tongues turn blue because they're obsessed with eating these flowers or whatever. But then you have someone like Tyrion saying, this is what I do. I drink wine and I know things, right? So
as an aside, I just got a T-shirt that says that from one of my friends for my birthday. I drink and I know things.
Fantastic.
So I think it's really interesting to think about, what like Game of Thrones as a historical reference, because we're sort of in this quote-unquote other world. We're sort of in this quote-unquote other narrative it's sort of a fantastic reality. The genre sort of lends itself to that, but it sort of really reifies the kind of like ideas and mores that we have around certain uses of substances. So, for instance, like if we make a 1-to-1 sort of equation, it's like there's a lot of misunderstanding, say, about psychedelics, something that I'm really interested in, and I thought of that immediately when I saw the Lotus Eaters, because I was thinking about how they were handled and how they were sort of demonized, in my words. But then sort of there's a celebration of sort of alcohol consumption and alcohol culture in a very patriarchal, warring class sort of culture. I think in the last episode you have the wildling, the real great Icelandic guy with red hair, talking about how he likes to drink a lot of sort of turned goat's milk
Yeah.
before a battle,
Right.
right? So that gives you a clue as to sort of how the substances are handled within that culture. And I would say that it sort of again sort of like reflects back to us what our own values on alcohol are, right? And that we can think. I mean, we can think of no single more destructive force. And I'm not just to be transparent. I drink alcohol, so I'm not like preaching about this, but I am talking about the social implications of what it means to have that in our dominant narratives, right? And then you look at something like Mr. Robot, where the main character is someone who is addicted to opiates, right? Mm-hmm. And he's doing it for a very specific reason, and the show handles it very specifically. Mm-hmm. He knows he's addressing his trauma. He knows that he's trying to seek relief from a really traumatic childhood. Mm-hmm. It's a knowing going into it, right? Mm-hmm. He knows what's up with it.
In a regulated thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And he's tries to get off of it at certain points, but he's also beholden to it because, I mean, as the show is unfolding, we see him just wrestling with these sort of like stories from the past emerging and how really awful that was for him. And so it sort of lends itself to a different perspective, which is addressing trauma, mm-hmm. right? It addresses this question of how do people soothe themselves when they're in deep, deep pain, and in this case, extreme psychological pain. And then you look at something like Mad Men, which again I think connects more to Game of Thrones, which is sort of like an alcohol, cigarette, caffeine-based sort of culture, a celebratory of those things within the sort of like male-dominant sort of working class, sort of like, and then you see sort of peaks of sort of psychedelic use, and even if it's not explicit, it's hinted at because people are having really tumultuous dreams, or even more explicit, as you mentioned,
Roger Sterling
with Roger Sterling's LSD trip,
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I'd just kind of it's something that I'm really passionate about, something that I'm really interested in, and I'm always interested in how the wider narratives sort of handle these things. Mm-hmm. And so, as you can probably guess from my introduction, I'm seeing it as extremely problematic that certain substances are demonized while others are elevated. Mm-hmm. And whether or not you look at someone like Don Draper and look at his attempts to get off alcohol as sort of like pointing to the evils of alcohol, nevertheless we're watching it. Nevertheless, that's the dominant substance within the show. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really interesting to think about the airtime, so to speak, each substance is given.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd sort of open up this discussion there and see what it kind of sparks in either of you.
I wanted to actually, before I forget what I was going to go ahead and say, because I know you have something to, Tim, I know you have something to say about this, and I don't really, for me, this is sort of an unknown quantity, right? Mm-hmm. I haven't really experimented much with any of this stuff. I'm already terrified enough as it is. I don't need any of my senses to be more heightened, to be more terrified, right? But what I would like to sort of get at, which was, I think, an interesting thing that you just brought up, and it sort of ties back to what we were talking about last week with the idea of a golden age television and the concept of high and low culture, mm-hmm. right? And we can almost fit drug usage into the same paradigm.
Yep, I was thinking along the same.
Right, so we can get to alcohol and we can present it in such a way as, don't worry about it. It's not, regardless of the actual effects, we can present it in a positive way where we can see that, this is the more accepted, right, among, I would suggest almost based on a class-based line, right, where the rich among us can go ahead and indulge in this on a greater level. We have a certain level of elegance to a person who, let's say, drinks wine or whatever, or consumes champagne or any of that kind of stuff. Whereas if you're a dude who's like, I'm heavily into meth or whatever, there's no way to make that elegant, right? So we do definitely have these kind of prescribed notions of the differences between what's all ostensibly a mind-altering substance. But we do evaluate those things differently. I'm sort of, like I said, I haven't really thought too much about this previously, but I'm thinking of it at this point almost as like on a class-based level, right?
Yeah, that's really
so
interesting.
I think that's something maybe that we can go into, but like I said, I'd leave it to Tim to go a little further into whatever he wants to go into.
Yeah, and as Gabe spoke, I was kind of my mind ran off in a bunch of different directions because there's a bunch of different stuff that kind of, I think, got opened up. But I think the most important one for me was this notion, the way that Gabe described it as a mirror of our reality. And we talked a bit about this in kind of last week's episode, where the politics on the show are largely reflective, and shouldn't they be more ambitious, right? Shouldn't art point towards utopian possibilities or transcendence? And Game of Thrones largely functions to reflect back to us our current state of reality in an altered timeline, so they can kind of, or an altered reality, so they can kind of make comments or, you know, do whatever they want to do under the guise of fantasy, but it's really just kind of a reflection of our political state. And so what I'd like to do is challenge that idea, right, and go back to something I talked about in week 1, which is Bell Hook's notion of popular culture being the dominant pedagogical vehicle. And what I would like to do is reverse that and say it's precisely through pop culture that our attitudes to drugs get formed at all. And so this isn't the show reflecting our reality. This is literally a show teaching people how to think about drugs in, you know, in an instructive way. And what it's teaching is that there are good drugs and there are bad drugs. To go back to something the comedian Doug Stanhope has talked about. A good drug, culturally speaking, is alcohol, socially acceptable. Bad drugs, cocaine, heroin, LSD, all the hallucinogens, really. So that's kind of the first notion that I found interesting. It's the idea, or how is it that our ideas about drugs get formed at all? And I think that we often think about it in terms of something like pop culture reflecting that, whereas I think it's much more involved in the creation of our ideas about drugs. And Game of Thrones isn't the first place where that happens, but it's reproducing the conditions of production, right? To use Altuzar's language.
Just to sort of go back to something that was just mentioned in this case, I was thinking of the idea that we came to the conclusion, at least, or one of the ideas posited last week with Game of Thrones was the idea that it was parroting real world ideas back at us, which is a reason for why it wasn't particularly interesting. And as you've just posited, the possibility is that actually it's informing particular depictions of drug usage, and it's informing our tastes. And in this particular case, like, I think that it can maybe go both ways, right? To where it's doing both, essentially. It's both creating ideas and informing what the nature of drugs are, and also getting to another position where it's saying, we can go ahead and depict for you, all right, well, you're going to see this, we're going to depict this for you, and you'll see that, all right, drug usage is bad necessarily, but this type of drug usage is okay. And I think it can operate on both perspectives in this way. I think it can do both things at once. Is sort of where I would come at it. I think that's kind of part of what I'm getting at in this particular sense. So,
yeah, and I mean, just to pick up on that a little bit, you know, what's the image that I had as we've been talking is there's a sequence in True Detective where he's driving down the highway and starts to have an LSD flashback. I mean, we're assuming it's an LSD flashback, but it could be it could be a mystical experience. We don't know.
Right.
But just to kind of put a little bit of our attention on what's happening behind the camera, like in terms of how say psychedelic experience is handled, right? And that has a lot to do with the director of photography. It has a lot to do with the sound designers, you know. And I think that was, I mean, that sequence, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend definitely checking it out, because it's awesome. One of the most well handled, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of like it comes out of nowhere. It's really disorienting for the person experiencing it. He sort of makes sense of it in whatever way possible. He's doing this really directive motion of driving, like this sort of really rational thing that you have to be, you know, present for. Except he's having sort of we're assuming sort of visual. I mean, we're seeing it. We don't know really what he's experiencing, right?
Yeah.
So, but also sort of audio hallucinations that we're privy to because of the sound designers and the musicians behind it. So, I just kind of want to open up a little bit of a discussion too about how it's handled in terms of the experiencer. Yeah. That the filmmakers actually have to attempt certain techniques to induce us into a dreamlike state or a psychedelic state, really like being critical about how that's being handled, because oftentimes it's a narrative device. Yeah. Right. Sometimes it's just used to show the characters like basically the character is wrestling with something deeply psychological, or the character has this crutch that they're leaning on, quote unquote. But that's why I bring up the True Detective sort of notion, because it was handled in a way that was much more nuanced. It pointed to sort of his worldview. It really connected deeply to where the character was driving at, and the like it really, for me anyways, connected to his philosophy.
Sure.
And how he arrived at that.
Right.
Like, he was subject to these really intense, mind-altering experiences that left him with a very skeptical philosophy on life. And it's one of the things that makes him a great detective, quote unquote. But it's also one of the things that, like, I mean, it grants him access to places that he wouldn't normally have access to. But it also sort of, like, inhibits him in ways because he's out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's not just this is the person's crutch again. This is the person's. This is how we demonize this character, as with the Lotus Eaters or something.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to touch back on the Lotus Eaters, because it's like they're able to do things that people can't do. You know, it's fantasy, but they can do things that normal people can't do. They can appear, they can reappear, and it's like, well,
we can assert the power of it, but then we can't go ahead and accept the possibility that it might not be terrible, right, to go into doing some of this stuff. Right. I think part of what this is getting at is a problem of writing in and of itself, where we have a limited amount of avenues to display a flaw in a character, and we've sort of come to the idea that the more complex, right, the more round a character we can make, the more we can add these sort of flaws and tragedies into their backstories. We want to, in order to complicate our characters, we need to find ways to make them seem more human. And I think in a lot of cases, this just comes down basically to lazy writing. So if I'm just, I'm writing a character, I can't think of a way to go ahead and complicate things for him. Fuck it, let's just make him a drug addict or something, right?
Right.
So in a way, it becomes almost like a crutch where we can just say, all right, we're not engaging with this in any real way necessarily. We're not making, maybe it's not even as particular as we want to show this in a way that's damaging. Like, not everything is like Requiem for a Dream or something. We're going to show how bad or awful this is. Sometimes it's just a writer has reached a level where he's incapable of creating an interesting problem for a character. So his problem comes down to, well, what can exist for this person? Well, fucking, they're a drug addict or something. Or here's how drugs can affect people. And nobody's sort of denying the possibility that that can go that way sometimes. But that's not the only reality. And it gets back to what we were talking about last episode. And it's not a question of representation based on race. It's not a question of representation based on gender, but it is a question of representation. How are we essentially portraying a particular minority or group in the culture? And this is how we've chosen to depict them for the most part in pop culture, is to depict a sense of flaw, weakness, loss, whatever, as opposed to depicting it, and as you were saying, sort of in Mr. Robot, a potential, if not healing, at least coping mechanism.
Yeah, sure.
And there's so many coping mechanisms. Right. There's so many coping mechanisms that are unhealthy for us anyway. If I'm sitting here drinking, a beverage, of an alcoholic nature after work or something because I'm tired of what my kids are talking about. Like, that's a coping mechanism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Freud literally talked about intoxication as a defense mechanism, right? I mean, this was one of the things. He didn't think it was ideal, but this was one of the ways in which people could cope with reality.
Yeah, and I'm going to suggest, like, that the possibility of this is we don't really have that many coping mechanisms as a human species. There's very little we can really do to, like, if you're experiencing some sort of existential crisis or if you're suffering through some deeper emotional trauma or whatever, you can kind of sit in it or meditate or do a few other things or maybe see a therapist or whatever, right? But there's really very little that you can do about this. And maybe there's not necessarily the stigma that should be attached to this because maybe there is a way to relieve some
and with
of
that
things.
back to the narrative of good and bad drugs, right? I mean, you've got pharmaceutical industries that are just slanging dope. I mean, that's basically what they're doing. But you've got ones that are legitimated by power. So this is a question of power. You know, somebody, you know, from the hood buying a dime bag of heroin to self-medicate for the very same reasons that someone's going and getting a prescription of Prozac or Paxil in a Beverly Hills psychiatrist's office. The existential state is no different, right? And it's kind of like the same thing.
Yeah. And there's a big difference between, you know, the Meisters sort of administering milk of the poppy to the extreme, you know, the concentration we have in terms of heroin. There's a big difference in how it's used. But I would also I was again sort of thinking about, you know, the Bill Hicks bit, which you probably both are familiar, and many of our listeners are all familiar with, which is, you know, he says, well, how about a positive drug story?
Yeah,
you know, you never see a positive drug story.
Yeah. How
How about the story where, you know, the guy takes LSD and realizes that all of our energy is condensed and that we're made of love and we're made from light and we'll return to that light at some point.
Yeah.
You know, sort of a mystic. He goes on this sort of mystical diatribe, and you don't see that much of it because why? Like we don't see those kinds of healing sort of aspects of the substances.
You know, I was thinking, it's funny you brought up True Detective, because I was thinking about this very question. I was thinking in terms of, because we talked for, you know, over the week about that this was going to be a topic of conversation in the podcast, representation of drugs. And so that made me think of True Detective. And in particular, I thought a lot about Russ Cole, his flashback sequence. I think that was episode 2. And connecting that to some other things that happened in the show. And I think that maybe True Detective functions or attempts to look at the complexity of drug use. In one character, and I'm kind of thinking this through now, but Russ Cole experiments with the entire spectrum of substances, legal and illegal. We see him, we know that he's done speed on the show. We know from the past he's done hallucinogens. We know he's an alcoholic, right? We know he smokes, right? So within this one character, he's almost a template for the entirety of the kind of American drug experience.
Yeah.
Right? And this did a whole bunch of things to him. Some good, some bad, right? And this is why I'm saying maybe this show was a little bit more complex in their thinking about drugs. Because remember that the end of maybe episode 2 or episode 3, they arrive at the church, and he has another flashback scene beyond the one in the car, and it's where we don't know if or if not he's seeing those birds form into that spiral shape. Right? And he's watching that. We don't know if that's real as audience, and he doesn't either. But at that point, this is a signal that he's operating almost like in Eastern philosophical terms, operating within the Tao, right? That there's things are lining up. There's synchronicity happening. He's seeing the sign everywhere, the spiral. It's represented organically. This is a sign they're at the right place.
Right.
And when he walks into that abandoned church, which is also interesting, right? If we're thinking about this in terms of spirituality.
Yes.
Right? The church is burned out. The church is destroyed. What is real spirituality? Real spirituality, right? Informed by the drug use, is then having a hallucinatory vision, which aligns you in, like Carl Jung terms, synchronicity. You walk in, and the show ends with, sometimes I think I'm crazy, sometimes I think I'm mainlining the truth of the universe. Mainlining the truth of the universe is a nice way to think about, you know, not only drugs, but connecting drug use, mainlining, injecting, slamming dope with a truth. Right?
Yes.
And so this whole kind of, and this show seemed to waffle back and forth. It was Russ Cole's fried brain, right, which gave him also exceptional capacity, but it was a trauma.
Right.
It was a deep trauma, which required self-medication. So that exposure, so this enlightenment that he came to was not a positive, go-lucky, Deepak Chopra enlightenment. It was a shattering, destructive, horrendous force that he somehow survived, gained essential insights from it, but then continually needing to deal with that trauma, to medicate himself. And I think that spectrum between enlightenment through trauma, all the way towards the use of drugs to kind of numb one against those kind of essential truths.
Yeah.
I think that is an interesting spectrum. If you're going to depict drug use, it seems much more realistic. I personally dealt with LSD flashbacks for years, and I've never seen them represented as well. The choices that they made in that car scene were fantastic. I was just watching Man in the High Castle last night, another kind of pop culture product, and there was a scene in episode 5 or 6 in which the Nazis are interrogating a resistance fighter, and they administer the subject LSD, truth serum, right? And it was funny. It's because there's almost a certain respect. Of course, the source material being Philip K. Dick's work, right? And we know Philip K. Dick was completely loaded on anything he could get his hands on, and also took the substances very seriously. He used them in a way to gain insight, inspiration, and also kind of like to pierce veils. He really thought he was seeing through to essential reality. Sometimes, I've read some of this stuff. I think he's pretty crazy in a lot of things, but a lot of stuff is. I know what he's talking about though, and I know how he went there. I can understand how that thing goes, and that'll be interesting in terms of when we start talking about conspiracy theory, because Philip K. Dick is, of course, preeminent conspiracy theorist, right?
With a real complex one.
Yeah, but drug induced, and in Man in the High Castle, the way that they depict it, you can tell when somebody has experiences with drugs. They either do a great job depicting it, like in True Detective. I don't know if it's Corey Fukunaga.
Corey Fukunaga, the director, and
Fukunaga,
then
right?
Pizzolatto, the writer.
And Pizzolatto, the writer. But so there's some work there, right? Some type of, I would imagine, some type of experimentation with these substances, right? To be able to kind of depict that.
Can I just step in and posit it's probably Fukunaga based on
True Detective,
based on season 1, season 2. It's probably Fukunaga because we watched Beast of No Nation and it includes.
Oh, that's right.
The moment where the child soldiers, I'm not sure what it was that they ingested, but they ingest something.
Yeah.
And you see this incredibly, almost beautiful depiction of color and imagery that I've never seen placed on film before.
I was shocked by that scene.
And it was beautiful, horrific at the same time.
Yeah.
But where was the horror generated from? The horror wasn't generated from the drug usage. It was generated from the fact that you have a bunch of kids trying to cope with the fact that they were doing something essentially awful and violent in the name of nothing really.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, I think we know where that comes from.
Right.
But I'm just using that to shit on
Pizzolatto. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, but I think you're right. I just didn't want to assert. That's my thought too. I just didn't want to assert that without knowing. But I think you make a stronger case, right? But so we see this fantastic, elegant description, and the thing with these experiences is there is no rationalization of them. Their representation always fails. You cannot, right? It's the experience is always way ahead of any description. And so whenever we see these kind of hallucinations or psychedelic experiences depicted in film or in television, I always watch them closely. They're so bad. They fail and they do nothing to convey what an ego shattering experience is. True Detective approached it. It pointed in the right direction.
Yeah.
It was a finger pointing at something.
Yeah.
In a really elegant, and I thought it approached it with humility. It didn't try to explain the experience.
Yes.
It just kind of grabbed a couple of the elements that happen
Yeah.
within it, and then drew existential terror through its music, through its lighting, all this stuff. Back to The Man in the High Castle, the other way you know if somebody's been, are you experienced, is that you don't describe it. So in Man in the High Castle, the way they handled it was they administered the drugs to the resistance fighter, and they just observed him from the outside. They did not try to replicate the experience. The film basically adopted the subjectivity of the Nazi. Watching this person saying this is like gibberish, no attempt at all to try to get inside the experience. Right? Those are the only two ways to kind of deal with this stuff.
That's why I think it's interesting to think about like behind the camera and in the editing bay and with the sound design. Is because you see more and more a sort of tendency towards a more hyper real experience in terms of being the viewer. They're trying to deliver something that's incredibly nuanced in a lot of ways. I was just at Disneyland yesterday, and
talk about hallucination.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a hallucination. The whole place is, I was thinking about Jean Baudrillard, this sort of postmodern theorist who talks about the hyper real.
Yeah,
and he talks about hyper real environments, and he talks specifically about Disneyland as one of these sort of hyper real environments. And I was thinking about him the whole day because I was like, he passed away, but what would he think of it now?
Yeah.
And I was on this ride called Soaring. It's Soaring Over the World.
Is it Soaring Over California?
It used to be Soaring Over California.
Changed it.
Now it's Soaring Over the World. And it uses this insane, like 200 by 200 anamorphic screen that you're strapped into this airplane, quote unquote, and you're flying over the world. My brain had no idea how to make sense of it. I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. I closed my eyes for half the ride.
Right.
I look over. There's a 10-year-old kid.
Were you on substances at the time?
No, I was completely sober. The point is, I couldn't let go into the experience because my brain didn't know how to assimilate it.
Right.
So I was in absolute terror, real terror. I was facing the real.
Yeah.
And I look over directly next to me, a 10-year-old kid in total glee, able to let go into the experience. Totally psychedelic. Like you're flying over, the fjords of Iceland and Peru and all these places, and
that's terrifying.
I think I'm going to die. And I look at the kid and I realize, oh, you just let go.
Yeah.
Like I might die in this. I look around and you can see the edges of the screen. I might die in this place with this fake jasmine Febreze being shoved in my face to make me think I'm flying through some lilac field or whatever.
Yeah. And it's awesome.
And the kid changed my experience because I realized the same thing happens in any kind of hallucinatory experience. Is you don't try to resist it.
Yeah.
You let go into it.
Yeah.
But I don't think that sitting in my couch at home really ever approximates that because it's so hyper real. I mean, there's so many more motions involved. There's all these attempts to become virtual reality. That film will become virtual reality. It wants to move us to that place where we are ultimately experiencing what's going on, but it can't. We can't quite do that even with the high definition, even with the complete surround sound.
Yeah.
Nothing replaces the sort of real experience yet. Yeah. But it's like we're attempting to sort of get at these more hallucinatory or altered conscious states because. And this is my assertion, is that humans have always tried to aberrate their consciousness. They will continue to aberrate their consciousness. There's no getting away from that.
Yeah.
And until we look at what that points to and why we want to do that, we'll have no peace with how we engage with these substances, essentially.
Yeah. And what you're saying really reminds me of Marshall McLuhan, who was a theorist in the 50s and 60s, but he was looking at media and technology. And I remember...
The media is the message?
Yeah, the media is the message. That's his favorite famous quote. But he also had this quote. Now, I don't remember it exactly, but this is me snapping into Eastern mystical philosopher mode, right? Where he talks about technology as humanity's potential escaped from itself. what technology is a reflection outside of oneself. It's alienated potential, concretized and manifested outside of oneself. So when we have a thing like the internet, what that is a deep desire for realization of the self, which is interconnectivity, a realization that everything is interconnected and everything is one. But what the ego tries to do is replicate that outside of itself from a position of fear, so that then this interconnectivity all happens without that core fundamental experience within the self. It's externalized, right, and lost, right? And so it's almost technology from that perspective becomes an atrophying of human potential, and almost humanity almost staring at its own collapse and death, right? And I don't know how we got there, except that's a kind of
Terrence
like a
McKenna,
drug-induced.
Terrence McKenna looks at McLuhan a lot, and Terrence McKenna would he talks about that it actually moves us to deeper connectivity. So he's wanting to build on McLuhan and say that these things are formed without, meaning outside of ourselves, but what they're pointing to is a denser connectivity.
Right.
So that we're all sort of sharing, we can all sort of commune on these experiences, whereas a mystical experience is like one of the endemic pieces about it is that it's you can't really communicate it to another person. But if we all experience it together, then there's a deeper sense of a shared experience. So he builds on that and kind of challenges McLuhan in the way that the internet is actually more of a sort of replication of mycelium or a rhizome or some kind of brain connectivity that we then can all commune on and understand, a shared mystical experience. So it almost has, we're sort of touching on the mystical and the spiritual here.
And that's precisely it. It's just this mystical experience. And I think the open-ended question is, from a cynical or an optimistic perspective about what that is. There's obviously a drive towards greater connectivity. The question is, to go back to Baudrillard, is this a simulation of the real?
Yes.
Right? And I tend to think that it is. I tend to think that it's a simulation of a core essential spiritual experience. Because from the mystical experience, you already have the connectivity. You just don't see it, or you forget it. So to replicate, or the need for connectivity indicates an alienation, but I mean, that's a kind of unanswered question.
Yeah, and a kind of an interesting segue into the next sort of topic, right? Conspiracy theory and making connections that aren't there, or simulations, right? How do we want to kind of jump into that?
Well,
basically, we always have a shitting on stuff
and we should
section. And so we can call this our shitting on section, shitting on conspiracy theory.
Oh yeah, and we'll come up with plenty of them. But I think just to sort of do a little bit of a bridge here, right? And you're discussing the idea of basically like the way that our brain interprets a lot of this stuff, right? And I think when we get to the idea of conspiracy theory, we especially want to discuss how is it that we think, or how is it that we come to think about certain things. And I think part of what we really need to just immediately arrive at is the obvious thing, which is to say that our brain is a weird, malformed piece of meat that hangs in our skull, distributing weird electrical charges that somehow makes us think about things or regulates certain influences. And there's a lot of ways that can get real fucked up, as anybody knows who has any kind of electronic appliance in their house. So what we are dealing with in the case of conspiracy theories is, how is it that we have come to be wired in such a way that we are so much more easily affected, or at least the society has come to be so much more susceptible to the idea of the conspiracy theory, and we're so much more willing to accept the truth of that being the real truth. Open your third eye, as you like. I had a freaking student in my class when I told him that, hey, maybe it's not true that there's lizard people or whatever.
I'm sorry. This is going to be a good conversation.
But he told me, Mr. Rowe, you need to open your third eye. It's like, listen, how can you respond to this? Yeah. Well, you really can. It's the initial, it's that initial impulse of, if we're going to go ahead and discuss something, and I'm trying to be rational and you want to be irrational, there's no way we can. There's no
shared common
shared communication. There's no way that can exist in the same field.
Yeah.
So I think what's happened here, and what we're going into as far as conspiracy theory, and there's so much of this happening. A lot of what I like to do is just troll around on the internet and see what's going on, and so much of what's currently existing and our explanations for anything that happens, political, global, whatever, happens to be based on a fantasy that we've created because it exists in a reality that we would like to believe exists. I'm going to bring up an example right here, like the 9/11 truthers from years ago. And, you know, before I say this, let me just say that any 9/11 truthers who happen to hear this, hopefully there's not any, but if there is some, you know, if you want to go ahead and get real mad about it, go ahead. But, I mean, we're not really dispensing anything that hasn't already been proven. The idea that, first of all, we have a situation or a scenario where there's a grand horror that occurs, 9/11 in this example, right? And our brain is so poorly equipped to process it or understand the heinous terror that comes from such an act,
or the
right?
complexity,
or the complexity of it, really, that we essentially come to easy answers for things. And I'm going to posit that maybe the conspiracy theory, part of the attraction to it, is it's such an easier answer to everything than to actually consider.
This brings up really good points.
To actually consider the truth of what happens in reality. So it's so much more difficult to explain why a set of buildings burn and are destroyed, and it's so much more difficult to go into the cultural expectations and why somebody becomes a terrorist and how to explain all of this. You know what's really easy to say? Bush wanted to go fuck up Iraq, so he set this up to blow up a couple buildings, right?
To justify
an invasion, right? It's so much easier to explain that than these complex thoughts and feelings about why people actually do things and how things turn out. And we can ignore ideas of, well, what functionally is the United States gaining out of this? And are we even really competent enough to establish a cover-up that would not come out immediately?
Right.
Where's the fucking Snowden who's going to come out?
And Cheney just creeping around, being a mastermind instead of just a moron.
Right. Where's the Snowden to just come out and be like, by the way, 9/11 was real peace, bitches. I'm going to fucking Sweden or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? That's not happening, right? And it would be so easy for this house of cards to fall apart if this conspiracy theory was actually a thing.
Yeah.
Of course it's not a thing, but why are we so willing to engage with that fakery, with the nonsense, right? And I don't know. Maybe let's just sort of throw that out there and see where we go with that, and see what that.
I totally want to pick up on that. I'm sort of like chomping at the bit to jump in here. In sort of like in my line of thinking with postmodern and narrative, I'm always thinking of both and being like that. There are many truths happening at any simultaneous at any juncture, right? And it's like, if you think any one person or any one system of power is like got it nailed down and is pulling us in a certain direction, it's like, I've got a horse I want to sell you, kind of thing. It's like nobody is in total control. Things are really complex, and nobody's at the helm of this thing. There are fucking opportunists everywhere, and there are things that there's meaning to be made. But I think what you're pointing to is like the folly of conspiracy theory is the tendency towards some kind of reductionary truth. Yeah. Some kind of like easy way to assimilate the information and make sense of it.
It's the Illuminati.
It's Illuminati, or it's whatever.
How come Jay-Z's last album sucked? Illuminati.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of there are a bunch of competing forces at play here.
Yeah.
All having vested interests and all going different directions, and that they're all colliding in some chaotic, disgusting display of how like tumbling through time, you know. So that's what I'll add.
Yeah, and I've had a problem with conspiracy theory for years now. It's like a arch enemy as a instructor in the classroom, because what I'll do is I'll be giving a lecture on anybody that's kind of in the Enlightenment tradition, which is basically some hostility towards illegitimate authority. So anybody critical of the state, anybody critical of religious institutions. Oh yeah, I like this guy. Have you heard of this? Have you heard of the 9/11 Truther movement? Have you heard? The instant one mentions careful, critical,
interesting
critique, that gets inflated or collated with like
contrarian
mentality. So if I'm teaching about Marx, oh okay, but you know about that flat Earth, right? Like stuff like that, or
the flat Earth.
Have you heard the chemtrails?
Oh,
you know about chemtrails? You know that? I'm like, no, I don't know that. I don't know about that. I don't believe in that. But with conspiracy theory, what I've noticed is that it seems to me to function like a mythology. It's a reduction, yes. It's a story with a obvious good and evil, right? Which positions similar to Nietzschean genealogy and morality. Psychologically, you are good. There's some great evil in the world that you're aligned against. And it tells a story. It tells a story about the world. There are dark, hidden forces manipulating everything. My first problem with it makes one absolutely powerless, right? So how are you going to resist the Illuminati? How are you going to, these are, almost, I'm struggling with language right now, but Manichaean. It's a very Manichaean worldview. And that's okay in particular ways. It's almost like a religious worldview. A conspiracy theorist almost maintains a Manichaean religious-like worldview, in which you have ultimate evil on one side, and good is you in this position of resistance. Of course, you're not resisting anything. It's just pure shadow. It's pure simulation. Whatever you're resisting, there's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
But I do think there are some positive elements to conspiracy theory. From what I've noticed, and this is purely personal experience, a conspiracy theorist generally has a healthy criticism and hostility of authority. They generally have, this is my anarchist politics, they generally distrust the state, right? They generally distrust dominant religions, they're often critical of capital. They don't understand how it works, though. Their fundamental alignment aligns them with me in my kind of rationalist anarchist project. They're allies in particular ways, but their analysis is poor. So they can be fellow travelers in a project of liberation or revolution up to a given point of time, but at some point in time there needs to be a confrontation kind of, or a conversation about where kind of conspiracy theory fails. But what I would like to also posit, not necessarily in their defense, but as an aside, is this move towards reductionary analysis. On the one hand, we call somebody who says, look, everything's being run by the Illuminati, 9/11 is an inside job, we call that conspiracy theorists, right? But what I'd like to assert is, going back to Baudrillard, getting at the real, that's not happening. What really happened with 9/11, that's not happening, right? What we're getting are representations, stories, narratives.
Right.
The dominant mainstream narrative about 9/11 is as much a conspiracy theory as what we call conspiracy theorists. It is as divorced from reality. The dominant story that there were 19 hijackers, which is precisely what happened, right? But that there was basically this vague Middle Easterns, right? We know now that they were largely Saudi. That's off the table, right? We attacked Afghanistan because a bunch of Saudis attacked, right? The complexity of what actually happened on 9/11 is not in dominant political discourse. Dominant political discourse used the events of 9/11 to engineer a series of policies for continued maintenance and domination over the oil-producing region, right? So whatever the story is, that this was an attack on our values, an attack on our freedom, that's conspiracy theory. In the same way that somebody thinks 9/11 is an inside job, it is as divorced from reality in my critical leftist radical anarchist analysis. They're equally as divorced from reality. We were not attacked because of our freedoms. We were not attacked because it's some great holy war. We were attacked for very specific reasons. We were attacked because we've been since 1919 had our boots on their necks. And if you keep your boot on somebody's neck long enough, they resist, right? And so if you want to eliminate terrorism, right, you've got to kind of stop participating in it, like to use like a Chomsky. That's off the table. So no one in the dominant political spectrum is anywhere engaged with reality. And so this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the difference between kind of conspiracy theory and structural analysis, right? You can do an institutional structural analysis of the way capital and the way the state functions, the way imperialism functions, and say, look, there are particular, and I can make that argument. It'll take longer than this podcast to go through it, about how kind of the Grand Order was established post-World War II with the collapse of Great Britain and the rise of U.S. dominance over the oil-producing region and the maintenance of vicious dictatorships, the training of all kinds of pseudo-fighter or proxy armies and stuff like that, and how those policies go bad and leads to blowback. I'm thinking about Chomsky, I'm thinking about Chalmers Johnson. There's a whole analysis there, which is not conspiracy, which I think is more rational, leads to entirely different conclusions about our policies, what we should be doing, and what happened on 9/11. But we call these folks conspiracy theorists, but at least they're aligned against the state and somewhat critical. At least they're not like the fucking American sniper asshole that are like, go America, and then going over there and shooting fucking women and children in the face, right? Because they're operating within a conspiracy theory too, that we are this Manichaean force of good versus the evil of really the barbarian in quotes, or the outsider, or the brown person, right? So for me, who we call conspiracy theorists, and what, it's almost back to this alcohol question. There's good and bad conspiracy theories.
Yeah, right.
Just like there's good and bad drugs. The good ones are those that are useful to power. And the conspiracy theory that is useful to power is that we're all innocent and they're all bad. Right? And so, but that aside, 9/11 truthers are fucking crazy too.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I think that's an interesting point to bring up. I don't want to entirely absolve conspiracy theorists in the same way, because I do think that there are some of these things, and I think that just as we went, if we go back to the first podcast that we talked about, where we were talking about the possibilities of revolution and where these things sort of exist, I think the only possibility for sort of alternative thought or places where we can grow new ideas exists on the sphere of the internet, basically. And unfortunately, what happens a lot is it results in almost this fucking virus-like spread of ideas, whether they happen to be bad or good. And what I'm specifically thinking about in relation to the conspiracy theorist stuff are going to be people who maybe are in the same area that we are politically, leftist essentially, right? Which is to say, I'm very struck by the consistent and constant, I think you've heard this from me before, the consistent and constant anti-vaccine stuff.
Oh, right.
And I've seen it from people who operate in the same area as I am, intellectually and politically. And I'm wondering about, first of all, your first thought with the last point, where how is this politically advantageous, right? How we have a conspiracy theory that works for us, and we have a conspiracy theory that doesn't. And here we have a conspiracy theory that was actually not even politically generated, but was just generated by the market, by capitalism. Right. So we had a dude who wanted to sell a book and sold a book which was essentially nonsense about how your vaccines are causing your children to be autistic, and when it was later revealed that that's actually not a thing, right? That's not true. That's not actually existent. Then we see that the ideas still exist, and they continue
like viruses.
Yeah, like once the virus has spread, right?
Yeah.
There's no way to curtail it necessarily if there's no way to immunize against it. And what is the immunization? What is the immunization that exists? The only immunization is education and ability to generate an ability to come up with critical thinking, right? Can you critically think through something? Like, if I were to talk to someone and say, what is the benefit of the government making its citizens autistic? That has no bearing in reality. What are you talking about?
Right.
Even if the belief is from a critical perspective where the government is always out to get you, well, you should realize that the government is always out to use you, right? But they can't use you if you're incapable of sort of basic functions, right?
And
so
also
how does that even make sense is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think what we've gone to in this era of a few things, a continued dismantling of the educational system where we say the teacher is responsible for the education of the child, and we disabuse the government from having some function in creating this problem where we give children textbooks on history where they refuse to talk about slavery in a real or honest way, right? Or where we have science textbooks that still are forced to talk about, intelligent design alongside evolution, right? Where we refuse to engage intellectually. And my sort of feeling on the matter is we've been intervened on at that point, and we've created a society that can't critically think these things through, and it's leading us to create our own ideas completely apart from the government,
Right.
which are also kind of dangerous and kind of violent. And this is sort of where my sort of deeper depression about the human state becomes kind of like an issue, which is where we've self-generated this. This isn't the product of anything other than a bunch of people spreading this on the internet and deciding that this was true and not analyzing any of it. And there's no government that wants this to be a thing, but it is a thing. And it exists. And this is the kind of thing that points at sort of my, especially considering the recent news, which we'll get to in a little bit, which is the continued depression with the human animal is such a flawed thing. And as much as we've evolved and as much as we're capable of, we're still very, very, very capable of self-defeating, self-destructive nonsense. And this is where the conspiracy theory thing translates from something funny like a bunch of people that believe lizards run the White House or whatever and are like peeling their skins off before they go to bed and like eating flies or whatever. That's fine, that's funny and you're crazy, but at least that's not really affecting much. When the conspiracy theories start actually affecting things like herd immunity, then it becomes a problem. And I'm not willing to absolve people of their lazy thinking in that way, although I'll understand where that comes from. And where that comes from is, unfortunately, like I said, this dismantling of education. So
I just have to add one thing I thought was really funny. I'm totally going to date myself in a Sanders kind of way and be like, the youth really gets it. The youth are so smart and they get it. But I saw this meme that I'll never forget. It was just so funny. It was George Bush, and he's making this hand motion. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah.
But he's making this hand motion that's
I think I shared that with
upside down. Okay.
Yeah.
And some brilliant. I mean, I imagine the kid's younger than me.
Yeah.
I'd like to imagine that he's younger than me, or she. Outlines 9/11 in the hand gesture, and it's so good because what it does is it casts this light upon. Look how ridiculous, I mean, this is how I make up the story. My story is that, like, look how ridiculous you conspiracy theorists are.
Yeah.
You're just like, you like, he's telling you.
Yeah.
He's telling you he did it right now.
Yeah, right.
In open, and this is a sign.
It's
so similar to, like, some kind of protecting someone's turf if you're a gang member.
Right.
Except he's showing you he did it.
Yeah, right.
He's at the helm and he's smiling.
Yeah.
He is smiling in that picture, and it's so good.
It's so good.
But they're also sort of pointing to the absurdity of conspiracy theory, right? It's like
absolutely.
It's sort of like it's you can reduce these things and you can make them, you can read into anything in any way that you want.
Yeah.
But the reason why I bring it up is because it's like the use of humor, of pointing at folks who are sort of in an Ouroboros sort of like chasing their tail sort of life style, where they're just increasingly frustrated because they're chasing these reductionistic ideas.
Right. And here's the biggest shade that I can throw in my political position. Conspiracy theorists, you are accepted by capital. You are accepted by capital. There's TV shows, Jesse the Ventura Investigations, that kind of bullshit, right? They're popular programming around this stuff, whether it's fucking X-Files or whatever. If you are accepted by the dominant institutional arrangement in the society, the illegitimate dominant institution, capitalism, right? Then you're not working against authority. You're some product of authority. Right? And your analysis is missing where power actually resides.
Yeah.
Right? And your analysis totally misses it. Right? And you that's the worst shade I can throw, right?
Yeah, it's like, think if you really want to figure this out, look at why X-Files was on Fox.
Yeah. There you go. This is precisely my point.
Yeah.
And also, why was David Duchovny such a wooden actor? That's a
Other thing that I kind of wanted to respond to was Jesse's notion, going back to, once again, like, human beings being retards, right? Like, or human beings being like something to be depressed about, right? like human beings are like, God, we're stupid, and this notion of education and all that. And once again, and this is something we were going back to with our conversation about identity politics last week. The role, what I'm analyzing is, from a postmodern position, this notion of a universal human, right? That there is such thing as the human. So even like existential problems, right? Or like the conversation we had about getting to true art. What true art is that which reveals the universal human condition of,
emotion, all sorts of stuff.
All sorts of stuff. But what I'd like to argue is, whenever we're looking at anyone, we have to talk about particularity. We're talking about human beings, right? Who's creating these fucking retarded memes, right? These conspiracy theory stuff. These are largely American citizens, right? Or if we talk about our culture, right? They're American citizens living under capitalism, largely male, suffering under neoliberal
the suffocating neoliberal
politics. And what neoliberal politics are like, you're going back to the education, rolling back the education, public education. Any public good is under attack. Everything's being privatized, right? So how do you get rid of something in the federal government? You defund it until it doesn't work. Then you say, hey, look, public education doesn't work. And then you cut it, right? But you defunded it in the first place. That's basically in a
It's a dismantling of intellect.
That's how it works. What you do is, like Newt Gingrich said, get public education so small you can drown it in a bathtub. I mean, this is the political practice across the spectrum. Yeah. And so I don't see this as some universal quality of human beings, that human beings are going to produce this garbage. the reason this stuff is emerging now is because of neoliberal policies over the last 30 years that have collapsed public education. They've collapsed all the critical venues, right?
And what it's produced is
and
a certain type of
and so we have a certain type of person. It's not a universal person. There is no such thing. That what we have are human beings under capital, largely, white male, with all their,
we'll get to the
checks, right? And so basically, I just want to draw attention to that notion that it's the idea that these are particular people in a particular time, in a particular place. And so if you can have different institutional arrangements and have different outcomes. It's not like at any point we're getting to some core, just universal, what is the human? The human always needs to be investigated in terms of its interdependence with the systems that it operates. It goes back to Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato argued that good people make good cities. There is a universal self, right? And good people can do that. Aristotle said, you're crazy. Good cities make good people. Bad cities make bad people.
Right.
And so if you want to change people, you change the institutions in which they live, operate, because there is no core person. Going back once again to the mystical thing. There's this process. Everything is a process of interconnection, and we're all reflections of one another in the institutions and everything else.
Yeah.
Like you are the entire universe focused at a particular point in the space-time nexus, right?
Yeah.
You're everything, right? And so if we have all these institutions and stuff, which are like we're producing neoliberal policies, Clinton-esque policies, and yet I don't even care about the conservatives. They're not even, they're a farce, right? They're dismissible. I'm going to deploy Slavoj Žižek's technique. He called it the good terror. The good terror is you just utterly ignore even talking about them. They're just so not even legitimately a political position that they're not even worthy of rational debate because of what we talked about earlier. How are you going to have a debate with somebody that doesn't accept the principles of rationality? Wrong device. What you do with them is you punch them in the face, or you subject them, or you do something. Because if you engage them in rational debate, they're not playing in that game. They're simulating they are. They're enemies. Forget them, right? But we still have some type of relation with the dominant liberal establishment, right? Their policies are producing conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers like a fucking factory. And it's through their support of the collapse of the public education system. To go right back to your point. Without the spheres of the humanities being enriched and supported, and we know they're not. We know we're collapsing the arts. Right. We're focusing on science and math, STEM technology, or science, technology, engineering, math, right? That's the focus. That's the move. Why? Because that makes technocrats and people that can manage systems already in existence. Nowhere is there people being trained, at least in the public systems, in literature. Move to the test, right? I'm sure, is this supported in your experience where you cannot just go talk literature with people?
No, I mean, we're just to back up this point, as a public educator, we are, and I hesitate to say too much on this because I don't want to give away, well, frankly, I just don't want to get myself into trouble. But what I would say is that the move consistently has been away from literature, not because it's not valuable, but because we want to move towards nonfiction texts or short texts that are instructional or directional, right? Yeah. Which is quick and easy, right?
Yeah.
And you're still encouraged to do critical thinking in the school system, which is where, here's where I would get at the idea that as much as we want to, as much as the system is shitty, we also have to be aware of the fact that the system is also run by people who come up from the same places that we do, and are therefore subject to the same flaws of stupidity as we are, and therefore don't plug the holes necessarily sometimes. So in the educational system, we're still allowed space to do certain things, and we can still you can still develop or do things that are somewhat entertaining or interesting for the kids, and are still asking critical thinking questions.
Yeah.
Right? But what they don't want critical thinking about is anything that is going to require sort of long form thinking, or anything that might be construed as even somewhat controversial, right? And by controversial, we mean necessarily, will you begin thinking about your place politically in the world, which is completely off the table, right? So we can discuss literature that's much older, like, as a person who's an English teacher, like, I'm still disgusted with the fact that we still have to do the Crucible. Like, this isn't, I mean, I'm sorry, this is not, or the Scarlet Letter. Like, how are these things still, relevant? I mean, they're interesting for a person who's deeply invested in literature.
Yeah.
But how is this, first of all, it's not interesting.
How does this affect my 16-year-old's life?
How does this affect anything that I'm doing with a 16-year-old? And how is this, first of all, in any way relevant to their experience? And second of all, spurring them to critically think about things. If they're not already oriented that way by their parents, they're not going to be.
Yeah, right.
So you set up a situation where it's destined to lose.
Right. But this is precisely my point. This is what I'm saying, is that these systems are producing this stuff. And up to a point, here's the problem with capitalism. It'll cut its own throat for $1. And so this Trump phenomena, right, or this Brexit phenomena, these are there's neoliberal policies all over Europe too, in particular under Thatcher in Great Britain, right? That's when these policies get initiated with Reagan and all that. It's a neoliberal attack on the commons, on the public good. There is no public good. Everything needs to be privatized, right? Roll back the welfare state and all programs associated with it. Healthcare, education, name it. And so we're producing these things. We're producing as a culture, and understand that neoliberal policies came into effect in order to satisfy capital. It was because it was more profitable. Short-term interest. Capitalism always seeks its own short-term profitability. It's much more profitable to drive incarceration, to drive education into the hands of wealth managers, to privatize, to construct private companies which can now educate, right? So you collapse the public system, drive everything to charter systems, drive everything to private schools, whatever that is, because there's $1 from the state treasury you can rip, right? And so the fundamental driving impulse is capital, institutes and neoliberal economic policies. The problem is now capitalism is so out of control, neoliberalism is out of control, we're producing Vaxxers, right? Out of the system. Capitalism doesn't care. How can we capitalize on that, right? It's producing conspiracy theorists because there's no training in real critical thinking, right? Or it's deeply delimited in the way that Jesse's talking about. Where critical thinking comes from is from exposure to great ideas. There isn't a procedure by which you sit down and learn critical thinking. You know how you learn critical thinking? You read great texts. You read new ideas. You're exposed to things that resonate with your soul, right? And if you're not doing that, then you're delimited, right? And so now we have a situation that it's what has been produced by this neoliberal economic arrangement is so out of control that we have this rise of this proto-fascism all throughout the West.
Right.
I mean, and this will transition into our next subject,
with Brexit, right?
With Brexit, but basically that's here. And so what happened is Trump is gaining support. I'm not even convinced Trump, and Jesse and I talked about this earlier in the week, wanted to win the presidency. But we're in a particular political climate in which the idiot factor is so high and so out of control, and I don't see much difference between a conspiracy theorist and a Donald Trump supporter, at least in terms of the quality of the analysis of their thought. They might align
no difference
on alternate sides of the political aisle, but they're doing the same mythological thinking. They're just positing different Manichaean visions based on some really convoluted value systems on both sides. Right? But now this machine is producing things. They're producing Frankensteins. Like Donald Trump and his supporters are a Frankenstein. They're a Frankenstein's monster, right? And so, I think. Do you want to grab this and kind of?
All right. Yeah. Well, I think before we do this, I think it might be sort of appropriate to go into a general maybe overview of the Brexit for those people who are not really following maybe necessarily, and also a description of where this kind of thing happens and what we think this stuff is symptomatic of. And I think I would go ahead and let's just begin with the idea that, look, the Brexit is a creation of, first of all, racism, right? So we've immediately arrived at a place where, look, let's get into just the basic demographics of the whole thing. Britain and many European countries are becoming more and more nationalistic and afraid of this sort of vague threat of terror, right? Or the vague threat of not even necessarily terror, but incursion from other European countries, Eastern European countries, stuff like that.
Where there's a lot of refugees.
Right, refugees coming in, stuff like that. The fear is over. We're losing our country, whatever sort of vague
ideas.
Whatever meaning that has in any sort of respect. So we've arrived at that place. And we have a situation where in sort of what I would describe as a moment of fucking overconfidence and frankly reckless abandon, their prime minister decided to hold a poll among his people where he assumed that he would get a rational output. He was going to get a reasonable response to
the referendum.
The referendum. He was assuming, okay, look, there's no way these people are going to vote to leave the European Union. It's an absurd idea on its face, right? There's no way this can possibly happen. And he puts it in front of the people, and through the process of a rational thought and frankly dredging up nonsense, you were able to get a hard right-wing coalition that basically pushed through the concept of leaving the European Union and successfully doing so. So what we have is a situation where the European Union is at risk of complete failure and collapse.
Because it's the fear is the domino effect.
The fear is the domino effect, right? And whether that actually exists or not is not even necessarily something that should be considered. It's more that the fear that this stuff is existing on such a strong level in so many other European countries, like, for example, France, which 60% of the population apparently wants to leave the European Union now. And these are all fears not driven out of rationality. These are fears driven almost entirely out of, one, racism, but I'm going to go ahead and suggest that secondarily, the continued failure of our leaders in the Western Hemisphere, the Western culture, to recognize a problem with capitalism, that if people do not feel like they have the ability to cash in on the experience, then what the fuck are we doing this for? Right? And I think that's becoming more of a problem, and our leaders are so slow to adopt this, or so greedy that they refuse to adopt it.
Or they have masters.
Right. And I think it was an interesting thing. I don't know if it was C-SPAN or whatever business channel had it on. And you remember Wall Street from the 80s with the fucking Gordon Gekko character? Greed is good or whatever. The person that character was based on has been making the rounds in the news and has been like supporting Bernie Sanders and stuff. And is backing, not out of an ethic or greater good, but telling capitalists, you have to at least grant the illusion that you can get, that people can migrate upwards. Otherwise, this crazy, stupid shit that you can't profit off of and which is dangerous and destructive is going to crop up. But the people we've gone in such a direction of pure and utter greed that people refuse to go ahead and engage with that.
My man's out there marketing it as guillotine insurance.
Right.
Insurance for the rich against the guillotine.
Exactly. So you continue. So you're going to continue these potential, and you're going to continue with nationalism, and you're going to continue with just generating an atmosphere where the corporation is way more important and where there's very little upward movement. And I think a lot of what has happened in England has less to do even with the racial component than with why can't I move up? Like why do I have to work a billion jobs, right? Why can't I engage with a decent living? And I think that's what's happened with this Brexit thing. And I think that the power structure there thought they were going to get the outcome that they wanted, and they didn't. And now look what a shit show this is. You have, in a moment of complete overconfidence and arrogance, given your uneducated population power to press the self-destruct button on their own country. And you did that. Right? That's your fault. And that's what we're dealing with as far as
and as an aside, just as a meta commentary, I think this conversation is really important to illustrate what this podcast is about. And what this podcast is about is asking the question of, if under neoliberalism we have an uneducated populace, where are they getting these ideas? Where are these ideas formed that this is a good idea? Where are they getting their politics from? And of course, my argument will be that a lot of this stuff is from shit like Game of Thrones and stuff like that. I mean, that a lot of these ideas about the political are being formed through pop culture. And I just wanted to throw that in there. As you're talking, I'm thinking about the citizen that engages in this vote and asking where are they getting their education? What is this sad state that we're in? There's a constructed or positive politics in that too, like in the sense of a movement of power, right? There's making moves in the world. That vote makes moves in the world. From where did they get the ideas? It's not in the education system. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of kind of like fanatic right-wing politicians and ideologues out there, but there are also all these popular culture constructions of these ideas that are then interpolating people or drawing people in, and people are constructing their identities based on this stuff, right? And I think pop culture we can trace that.
You have anything on this one, Gabe?
I mean, I think that, I was most interested in one of the articles I think that one of you guys sent to me, which, this happened last night. I'm like, I don't even know what is going on.
Right.
But, one of the articles was from The Guardian. I can't cite the author, but it was really interesting because she was talking about how angry she was with the outcome. And she had cited a few Twitters from, younger people in Britain who were outraged by the decision. And it really spoke to me because it was like returning to this idea of the complex density, and that we're moving towards novel complexity, right? And the idea of the Earth as a brain or something, and you want to create as many connections as possible, and that's actually a good thing that we're connected in a certain way. The EU sort of kind of can represent that. And one of the really angry Twitters, I can't quote it totally, but paraphrase was sort of like, our generation will suffer from the unknown connections that we have with other people, the marriages that were potential, the jobs that we could have had, the ease of travel, the kind of that kind of way of connecting with the rest of the EU is actually, that's a big consequence. They weren't just, it's not just like pie in the sky stuff. This is like a way people will be cut off, not only from going outside of their culture and learning about, which is how we learn about the world. All you have to do is travel to learn critical thinking, but also people coming in, and the limiting of the ideas that are floating around in your culture because you become more nationalistic, you become more reductionistic, you become more solidified, you become more hubristic and beholden to your sort of dogmatic ideas. And it lends itself, it's like a feedback loop. We're talking about education, and it's like now we have a situation where we're building quote unquote walls. These are real things that are happening.
And as an aside, just a theoretical note, all this is a massive violation of Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. He posited basically three rules of capital. One is that capital must be mobile, That therefore, in globalization, right? He was speaking in terms of inside of a particular state, but right, we're in a multinational global situation. So extending Adam Smith's theorization to the contemporary situation, capital must be able to freely move across state boundaries,
Right.
to seek lowest
Those
labor
who need
costs,
them- yeah, those who need
right?
them.
Simultaneously, labor needs to be free in order to seek highest, right? Or if conditions in a particular region get so bad, then they need to be able to seek employment elsewhere. Freedom of movement is required. Those are the first two laws of capitalism, right? According to it. So what you do is we still maintain movement of capital, but then collapse people's mobility, which is largely what this is about, which is
Right.
restricting immigrant labor flows,
Yes.
right? And so if you do that, basically under the guise of capital, this is actually not even capitalism. This is some kind of neo-capital. It's a much more feudalistic, it's almost like a neo-feudalism in which you have basically serfs bound to particular
Regions.
geographical
Yeah.
locations in which masters or dominant free-floating systems can then impose terms on their labor, which is a violation not of Marxism but of capitalism itself, which is a huge consequence of this, right? Which means that quality of life for many of the people that voted for Brexit is going to further deteriorate economically,
Yeah.
just with the restrictions on kind of mobility from kind of withdrawing from the EU and kind of ease of travel and all that.
Yeah.
Just I don't know, just want to throw that out there. That
No,
just how contradictory all this stuff is, and how blatant the power display is.
right. And I think another interesting component of this, and maybe an opportunity for some optimism in the podcast, is a comparison I saw made in many quarters of the media. Because I was up real late last night with my wife, and we're sitting around watching TV, and she fell asleep, and I was watching TV, and I saw this happening. I was like, oh shit. And the immediate comparison that was made was, how does this help Trump? Or
Right.
how is this comparable to the Trump movement? And one of my kind of little niche interests that I've had recently is mainly came out of like sports. Actually, was this idea of analytics, the statistical movement, the idea that we're going to find ways to break things down on a level where we remove gut feeling or reaction from things and we just look at the particulars of the situation itself. And what was interesting about the Brexit, and I saw this on Twitter last night, was 18 through 24, I think it was, like 18 through 24-year-olds voted almost overwhelmingly in favor of staying in the EU. And the biggest, the biggest wave the other direction to leave were the age 65 plus. People who won't even be around necessarily for the actual outcome of this decision. And the other demographic thing I saw that was interesting on it was obviously who's voting for this? Well, it was mostly lower middle class whites. And just as it is in the United States, who are the people voting for Donald Trump? Lower, well, I would say not even lower middle class, lower class whites with a limited education. And one of the few moments for optimism that I've had in this entire season politically that we've gone through was realizing the key difference, which was that in spite of what they saw as huge immigration numbers in Britain, their immigration numbers are nothing compared to what we have in the United States and the diversity that we have here. So we can come to a place where at least I can, sleep somewhat more comfortably with the knowledge that I'm not certain that something like that could happen here, right? But this is something that is happening elsewhere, and at least should be instructive to the rest of us that we need to be careful of these sort of nationalist movements as they crop up, and realize the intellectual bankruptcy of them. Because the next day, the people who are behind this don't seem to have a plan as far as what's going to actually happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you've done this.
Yeah.
What are you going to do with this?
Right.
You've left the EU. Okay, now what?
Yeah.
You just destroyed the pound. You're going to invest in gold. What are you going to do?
Right.
So there's at least this as a moment of instruction, and maybe if we destroy education, at least that there's these moments of instruction on a huge event level like this, which might teach people something about what actually happens when you follow through with your nationalistic bullshit.
You're right.
Which is to say, this is what happens.
Right.
You ruin your country, you essentially destroy possibilities for your youth, and maybe think about what that is.
Yeah.
And also maybe take some solace in the fact that this isn't a country anymore which is dominated entirely by white people.
Right.
Okay? And take some solace in that. That
Yeah.
diversity is saving us from
Yeah.
the shit that's happening in
Right.
Europe.
Yeah.
And maybe that's sort of at least a beautiful thought that comes out of this.
That's a really elegant way to think about that. The thing that I'd like to see in addition, though, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking in terms of, I'm thinking about Lacan, and I'm thinking about Zizek in particular, and how, from a psychoanalytic angle, what is the definition of fascism? Like, how do you recognize a fascist system? And you can look at it politically, you can look at it economically, you can look at it from a psychoanalytic lens. And from the psychoanalytic lens, the definition of fascism requires collective disavowal. And what that means is a recognition of social ills, problems in particular, in this case for the white person, right? That can be lack of economic mobility,
Right.
Whatever the ill is, right? Life expectancy going down, all these things, and what you do is you then project all fault for that situation onto another, right? And so we can see this. That's the definition of fascism. So basically, that's the political project is to mobilize anger and resentment towards an easy other for social, political, and economic problems, right? So you have an easy scapegoating of an other. If that process is happening, you have a fascism from a psychoanalytic lens. It's a psychological process by which every fascism is basically a failed revolutionary analysis, right? Or it's a failed political analysis. It's all blaming one particular group, one particular type of person for instance, the failures of neoliberalism. So the failures of neoliberalism are, my kids aren't getting educated, I don't have health care, right, in the United States at least, or my economic mobility is deeply restrained, my kids are not going to be as good off as I was, right, and that's the total reversal. I'm making less money due to inflation, all these kind of, there's massive wealth stratification, and what you do is then you get a ideologue which then points that population which is disenfranchised in that way or hurt in that way, you point that at something. And so in the case of Trump, it's Muslims and Mexico, right? In the case of Great Britain, it's immigrants, right? It's refugees. It's largely South Asian and Middle Eastern and African, right?
And even Eastern European.
And what you do is, so you take the entirety of anxiety produced in white subjects that feel that their lives are being taken from them, and then you put all that animus on an outsider and another, you direct it that way. The idea that the dominant political consideration over all these other considerations, in the terms of Great Britain, we're talking about in terms of the stability of the European Union, we're talking about trade issues, we're talking about travel, we're talking about like the organization of an entire state, and you're willing to tank that over an other. That implies such a scary deep investment in kind of a mobilization of a type of proto-fascism, which is really on the rise, at least from a psychoanalytic lens. Like, and the same thing here. This Trump phenomenon, like, and so that I think that parallel is really. I think it's really frightening.
Right. And the thing is, I've found it very frightening as well. But like I said, I think that the only solace that we have from that is that whereas in Europe it seems to be a growing phenomenon where this is increasing.
Yeah.
When I look at it in America, even when I try to get, and as my natural mode is to sort of look at things negatively, even when I try to, I can't help but recognize that this is an increasingly diverse society. Yeah. And this is, the demographics here are not the same. Mm-hmm. And the Donald Trump voter here, mm-hmm. and without being, too crude about it, is dead in 20 years here.
Yeah.
They're not going to be around much longer. Mm-hmm. And whereas I see this country current Donald Trump fascination on a very tiny level. I mean, the last poll I saw was he was like 39% or something. Mm-hmm. He's not even doing well at this early stage of that campaign. I would bet large amounts of money that there's no chance he wins, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. There's what we're seeing here is, I think, the final throes of white power, mm-hmm. So for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
This is the final expression of frustration.
Yeah.
God damn it. We just had 8 years of a black president.
Yeah.
Can I get a dumb white guy in there like George? Can we get that back?
Yeah, right.
I want to get back to that. But you can't.
Yeah.
That's over. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the few optimistic things
we'll see how terroristic white males get. Because that's the other. I agree with you. That's a general trajectory, but they're not going to go down without a fight. It'll be interesting to see over the next.
Well, look, all the militias they've set up and all of this stuff. The only thing I would say to that is, I mean.
Go ahead.
Look how incompetent that's been.
Yeah, right.
What was their when they occupied that? What was it, like a nature reserve or wherever that was? Look how weak-willed and corny that whole thing was. So, I mean, yes. I'm not all that frightened of our particular...
Well, I'm frightened of domestic terrorism. I'm frightened of lone gunmen going into movie theaters, not because they're weirdos, but because they're politically motivated. That's not a far stretch.
Right. I think that is already occurring here.
Yeah.
And I think that's occurring for different reasons, I would say. Like that, the whole... well, let's maybe table that, and I think that maybe this is like a good spot to sort of...
I just want to ask Gabe, because Gabe's been quiet for a while. Do you have anything to...
No, I mean, I think your analyses are really interesting. I mean, the only thing that kind of sparked for me was when what are the examples we have that give us hope? I thought that when I heard the word hope, I started thinking of Spain, mm-hmm. and I think it was maybe the 1500s with Moses Maimonides, mm-hmm. and it was a really flourishing time in which diversity was really celebrated. At least when I was there, you can go to Sevilla and see a statue of Maimonides, and what it represents is a time where Muslims, Jews, and Christians were all living in harmony, mm-hmm. and it was a time of incredible prosperity. Mm-hmm. And they still have a library that's a conglomeration of all of the sort of ancient wisdoms together. Yeah. And it was a representation of what real diversity and collaboration could be. Yeah. And they look back to that, and I think that survives in the anarchist tradition in Spain, because they look back to a time where the idea of inclusion was so celebrated that it really benefited a lot of people. And that might be idealistic to some point, but I think it points to a possibility, which is sort of the absent but implicit in what we were all talking about, sort of like the fascist state. What is the opposite of that? What is it that we can actually hope for and move towards? And I think that's an interesting example. But it's the only kind of piece that I'll add to that.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is going to be episode 3 of Shoot the Dancing Bear. Maybe we'll come back next week with a little bit of an extension of some of these ideas that we maybe had a table or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the end. So awesome. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.